Transnet is back in the spotlight with a slew of resignations of top executives. CEO Portia, CFO Nonkululeko Dlamini, and Freight Rail CEO Siza Mzimela have all bowed out. But many critics have said that the entity has been going off the rails for some time, and this has had dire consequences for the economy. Let's speak now to independent analyst Khaya Sithole. Very good afternoon to you. Welcome to Newzroom Afrika. The parastatal has been performing poorly for quite some time now. We saw key executives resigning. Siza Mzimela also jumping ship this week after she came under enormous pressure from the Transnet board to resign over the past 4 weeks. Her resignation, of course, coming as no surprise, especially after the CEO and CFO both resigned. Why have these resignations, would you think, have taken so long?
Good afternoon to the viewers. I think probably one of the biggest challenges that we've seen at Transnet at the governance level is that there's been an evolution of the board itself. The board that was there in 2020 is very different to the board that is here now. And what we saw is that the board that had been put together a few years ago was given what you may really refer to as a mandate to deal with the legacy issues relating to corruption in particular. And of course, what they then had to do was to try to put together some particular elements of remedial actions in order to be able to deal decisively with some of those lingering effects of what they refer to as the state capture years. What we are now seeing is that this new board is obviously come in with the need to now really deal decisively with the operational and management issues. And we saw a couple of weeks ago that the minister essentially issued a directive that they needed to assess whether the executives that they had in place last month indeed were the right executives to do the things that needed to be done with an organization like Transnet. And obviously the net result of that particular assessment has been the decision that perhaps they do need to find new executives to fill these positions. So that is why we've ended up here. But I think the question of why it's taken so long remains an important one, because one would imagine that even before the minister issued that directive, there should have been a process of performance management within Transnet that should have asked important questions about what the executives have been asked to do and whether they had achieved those performance indicators, and if not, whether they should be looking for new executives. So it's not very clear why that process wasn't undertaken by the previous board and why even this board took so long until the minister issued that directive last month.
Yeah. In measuring the impact, how exactly is Transnet now stifling the domestic economy?
So Transnet, just like Eskom, are obviously central to the entire economic architecture of the country. I think as a country that was, whose economic DNA was essentially founded on the movement of goods in and out of the country, you do need to have very clear, very efficient logistics channels. And obviously Transnet has not been able to live up to the expectations of the industry and stakeholders. Transnet has also not been able to live up to even its own operating capacity. So the consequence of that is that we've seen that in relation to the movement of goods, particular stakeholders have opted for alternatives, which essentially is the road network that has seen the bulk of goods moving in that particular direction. That has particular consequences for the road network, for the road infrastructure, and it costs the country in many ways. There's also been the reality that in the absence of Transnet's optimal capacity being fully available to everyone that needs it, there are many more businesses that then say, well, instead of us contracting to ship so many goods, let us not do so because we cannot guarantee that we'll be able to move those goods. So there are definitely the direct consequences in relation to those that are intimately involved in the Transnet value chain. But there's also the intersectional effect on the economy at large, because we now know that mining companies, for example, can be able to demonstrate that had Transnet operated at optimal capacity levels, they would have been able to generate much more income, they would have been able to pay more taxes. The fact that that hasn't happened means that National Treasury and SARS have a bit less to work with than they otherwise would have had to allocate.
And based on its own audit report of March this year, it's quite striking to see that immediate remedial action is not taken when it comes to Transnet.
So when you do look at the Auditor General's assessment of some of the key issues there, one of the expectations is that when an organization identifies that particular processes have not been followed, which results in fruitless and wasteful expenditure, one of the expectations is that management then puts a plan of action together to ensure that they firstly have fully identified and assessed the root causes, and then also make sure that these issues do not recur. And I think from what we're seeing in that audit report, the plan of getting that right simply hasn't been put together at Transnet. So the remedial action plan that one would expect in relation to issues that are identified by Transnet itself and by the auditors, they don't seem to be supported by a very clear roadmap of how we're going to fix it and how we're going to make sure that it doesn't happen again. And when you read the substance of that audit report, it does indicate that that is a big blind spot in relation to the internal management of Transnet's affairs.
To what extent, Khaya, would you say that politics and organizational governance impacts on operation, considering the numerous attempts to turn the parastatal around in the past, but with very little success? Why is this? Is the state not clear on its vision, perhaps?
Well, I think the question of the political dimension is a complicated one in the sense that from what we know, at least from what is publicly articulated, the political dimension only happens at the appointment level, where we do know that the minister does indeed have to present the shortlist to cabinet, and of course cabinet then either blesses that shortlist or rejects that shortlist. So we know very well that there's definitely an element of political influence in relation to the appointment process. What is less clear is whether the shareholder representative maintains a continued involvement in the strategy development and in the operational oversight, because obviously that is where the board must come in. And if the boards themselves have got absolute autonomy and they can do what is best for the organization, then the political dimension wouldn't be as explicit. But I think we all share the suspicion that, unfortunately, when it comes to the portfolio of public enterprises, that political influence is a bit more amplified than it needs to be. And these boards do not enjoy the type of independence and absolute autonomy that boards of this nature need to have in order to be able to execute on their mandate. So you do see some of these back and forth exchanges at Eskom in particular around the appointment process of the CEO that clearly indicates that there are ongoing engagements with the shareholder minister. Whether that is desirable or whether that is regulated properly, only those boards can ever tell us.
What about the role of Public Enterprises Minister Pravin Gordhan at Transnet, which has also been under scrutiny? I mean, there's been calls. I saw one call from the DA asking whether or not he will be vacating his position. What role should he be playing when it comes to accountability there?
Well, I think obviously it is a state enterprise, and of course all state enterprises have to have some element of political accountability lines. And the way the government has decided this should be done is that they've created the state enterprises portfolio, and that is where the accountability lines are. What we also know is that the ANC has taken the position that they actually want to abolish this particular structure of having the state enterprises ad hocly put together, one must add, into this particular portfolio. And if they then remove these entities back to what they refer to as their home or their natural habitats, where Transnet would then be moved elsewhere, Eskom would move elsewhere, then you may have a different dimension altogether. But until that happens, this is the political system that we have, and this is the minister that we do have. And I think the criticism against the minister is that not only does it not seem to understand the sense of urgency associated with dealing with these particular issues, it also feels like even when the boards do escalate the nature of the crisis, the response rate just isn't as strong and as robust as it needs to be. And I think the sense of frustration is really born out of the fact that these people that we're trying to assist govern the country by putting up our hand and saying that we will exercise oversight over these entities, they don't seem to be able to give us the breathing space that we need in order to do things properly, and then support us in instances where we need their support in getting appointments through, for example. So there's definitely a lot to be said about the efficiency and the way in which the Minister of Public Enterprises has overseen this portfolio. It is very difficult to find a lot of bright spots in relation to how this portfolio has been overseen ever since it took over.
What about the factor around the signaling of job losses, mining job losses as a result of Transnet's woes?
Well, I think obviously the consequence of an organization like Transnet underperforming is that there are always going to be casualties. The casualties are primarily going to be the businesses that are at the core front of that interface with Transnet in many ways. So businesses that rely primarily on the country's logistics network being viable and operational. they'll be the ones that are the primary casualties. And I think obviously the fact that we've got an unemployment crisis, I mean, that's undesirable, but that's a reality of what we see in this country, and it is something that definitely needs to be addressed.
Yeah, very well. Thank you so much for weighing in on the discussion. Independent analyst Khaya Sithole, they're speaking about the many challenges around Transnet, which is back in the spotlight with a slew of resignation from top executives.